Daniel, and then he can take it from there. So welcome everybody, and this is Daniel.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Monday. Hope that your day's gone well and you've attended some of the sessions here. My name is Daniel Vidani. I'm the president of Innovation Studio. Some of you may have encountered us as formerly Venture Cafe New England. We ran the Thursday gatherings at the Cambridge Innovation Center. We also run District Hall across the street and Roxbury Innovation Center as well. It's really just trying to make innovation, entrepreneurship, and business ownership attainable for all. So happy to be here. And I'm excited to bring this panel. I was listening to the previous session and felt like, this is some good stuff that might bleed into the next conversation. And, this group of people here that I'll introduce very quickly, we spoke about a week plus ago, and we were having a really good conversation about some of the opportunities that we can take this conversation into. And the great thing is that Steele, who's sitting right next to me, he was able to make it because originally he wasn't going to be able to do in person. So I'm glad that he's here, and I think it'll offer a great interactive conversation. So we'll leave some room for questions and hopefully create a really great end of day here for all of you. So thanks again. So I'll introduce people really quickly, and then I'll let them tell their story. The question I'll have them do is give a quick background on how each of you got to the role you're in today. So we'll start from that. Why don't we start with Stephanie?
Sure. So I'm Stephanie Capoletti. I'm the COO of Chariot Payments. And the way I got into this role is I had maxed out in my Fortune 500 old world finance role. And I posted myself for a job on AngelList. I talked to a number of founders and I didn't quite get the right fit. So I went into a consulting role, and I hadn't taken down my AngelList profile. And my CEO called one Saturday afternoon while I was out getting bagels for my kids. And we chatted for literally about 4 hours, and the rest is history.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Next person I'd like to introduce is Timothy Miano, Executive Director of the MIT Office of Innovation.
Hey, everybody. It's really nice to be here with you all. So I am the Executive Director for the Office of Innovation. We just opened the new MIT Innovation headquarters. So I've been at MIT for about 5 years, designing and building the new innovation headquarters. So we support about 500 startups on an annual basis, 1,800 students. And I've kind of been mentoring and advising student level startups and early stage companies for about the last 10 years. So I've kind of seen a lot of early stage hiring, sort of first 5 to 20 hires, and some of the pitfalls and downfalls and upsides of some of that. So I hope to provide a little bit of insight there.
Great. Thank you, Timothy. Appreciate that. And last but not least, Steele DeVito. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Excited to be here. By the way, I'm here in person because we had 3 people decide to show up, and they put a lot of pressure on me. So, but it's nice to be here today. I'm the president and CEO of the Steele Group, and we're a brokerage firm that focuses exclusively on helping technology and life science companies all the way from early stage to global occupiers. So excited to be here, excited to answer some questions. And I feel like kind of a startup founder who's kind of got I guess how I got here today is I worked in the industry for about 8 years, and working for large players like Cushman & Wakefield down to some small organizations as well. So got some pretty good perspective and just thought there was a better way to do things.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate that, Steele. So why don't we get started? So the title of our panel tonight is Put Me In, Coach. Great line there. And hiring and delegation at an early stage startup. So, as you can imagine, the path towards getting your company up and running by yourself is one thing. But the challenges of basically who you're going to hire next and who are the key people in your organization that you have to bring in, the whys and the pitfalls. That's really what we want to talk about today. And the 3 people here today that are joining me really have some unique perspectives, I think, that can offer everyone here. So why don't we go ahead and get started with the first question. So Stephanie, why don't we start there with what do you look for when hiring for the first time? Is there a personality type? Is there key departments, roles, as you're thinking through based on your experience and knowledge here so far?
Thanks. So when I'm looking to hire and add to the team, it's really important that there's an alignment with the vision and the culture that we're trying to build. And in terms of personality type, I tend to think about it more around, characteristics and attributes. And what I mean by that is really the priority for me is not so much the experience, that all has to be there, but all things being equal, it's really about aptitude and attitude. And what I mean by that is you're going to go through so many challenges, ups and downs, slow points, high stress times. And for me, the attitude in terms of that person, how they're able to handle those challenges, what they bring in terms of their outlook, their approach to handling those. That's really important as I think about how to grow not only the team and what the company needs to be successful, but also the type of culture and environment that we're aspiring to build as well. So that's a little bit about how I think about hiring from that perspective.
Right. Thank you, Stephanie. I like that aptitude and attitude. Some things to think about from that perspective. And I like the first part you made about the vision and kind of the culture, but we'll get into that a little bit here. Steele, why don't you kind of give it a crack at that one, if you don't mind?
Yeah. So it's been interesting. I guess in a very short period of time, about 12 months, we have about 22 people across 2 different platforms. I'd say hiring can be very challenging, and I think there's a couple different components that we really focus on. Number one is definitely the person, right? There's certain these, like, as a company, it's hard to establish kind of those key true values as a business, and finding those people who are bought in on your mission, super important, and also have the same values as you. Secondly, I'd say letting go as like a founder is really hard, right? Letting go of certain tasks and trusting people to do certain things. Now, for me, I'd say one of our biggest hires was we hired a COO about 4 months ago. The COO fit a lot of the boxes, and I think someone who really had the best interest of not only me but also the business, right, which is very important. However, you can't expect that person to do everything, right? You kind of bring someone in and you start loading that person up with a lot of different tasks. You still need to find ways to supplement that person. But generally, I'd say you're gonna kind of feel it in your gut. I definitely go through your process. It's a lot of people are in a rush as early stage founders as well to just make decisions, and don't be afraid to slow it down a little bit, make reference checks, and make sure that people are really bought in on your mission. Because as you grow as a business, in some ways it can become easier because you have that much more scale and you can take a little more risk. Where these early hires, you definitely want to find, we call it kind of the bunker team, the group that's really going to be in the mix fighting for you for as long as possible. And we've definitely had some, I guess, misfires as well, and it's, for me, like, I love giving people second opportunities and second chances. You want to do that. But also when it's a small team, you can just feel the cultural implications as well, right? Where you want to make sure you have the right team in place to really scale effectively. Because if one person's off, you really feel it as a unit. Is something that we've definitely seen. And that's been just through learning, and yeah, hopefully that was helpful.
Great. Thanks, Steele. And your company's what, a year plus in existence?
So, a year and 2 months.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're in the thick of it in terms of that building process. So
No question.
yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about kind of that early stage kind of vision and mission aspect. I think that's an important factor that, again, I heard before in the conversation. Timothy, and you've been working with a lot of young people still in school, given your role. Tell me a little bit more about what you've seen in this same question here.
Sure, yeah. So I guess one differentiating factor is, are you hiring a senior person or you're hiring a junior person? Because your analysis there might be really different. But I think across the board, right, anything under your first 15 to 20 hires, there's a bunch of consistent features, because the nature of your organization really changes once you reach this tipping point of 15 to 17 hires, because at that point there's too much information and too many connections for you to keep track of. And below that, you can kind of keep a handle on things, but people that are going to be problem solvers, hardworking, team-oriented problem solvers. I think beyond that, you can kind of make a decision. Are you going to be willing to hire sort of lone wolf or prima donna type people that are going to have outsized impact, but aren't going to be good team players? And I think you have to make a decision. Am I going to have a company that has that type of person, or am I just not? You know, intelligent minds can disagree on that question, but for that first 15, 20 people, people that are really consistently going to be team players. And then when you're interviewing, really sort of trying to get at those questions around, you know, don't just tell me like what problems you've had or like what hardships you've faced. You know, talk to me about how you've done well, who you've done well with. And even when you think about references and recommendations, you know, ask, you know, do you have references from peers and other teammates that would, you know, verify that you're somebody that plays well with others? Because if you don't have somebody like that early on, one bad apple ruins your whole culture. Yeah.
Thank you, Timothy. So I'll turn it back over to Steele, because I really, you know, we talked about it from the previous conversation about vision and mission. And, you know, I think that every organization has to figure out how to have a North Star, that vision that's going to be, you know, right there in front and center, because at the end of the day, having that North Star is that's there when you get stuck. Okay. So when you get stuck, you need to be able to refer to something that's going to be very simple and easy to listen to and check yourself, right? Really. And so, Steele, I'd love to kind of hear from you. What did you do to kind of make sure that from a cultural perspective and building the team, specifically 1 year plus into your organization, how have you accomplished that? And how has that gone?
Yeah. So first, I'd say that we were very fortunate to work with some very passionate people. That's most of our client base, or, you know, they can be founders, but they're people who are building businesses. You know, I'd say that's that's a common theme across all of our clients. They're very, very passionate. You know, and I think, and I'm a very passionate person in many ways. There's a lot of people who might not say that, but I am. But I'm passionate about what we do. It's a big reason why we launched the firm, and we've certainly invested a lot of time and resources, and we believe in a mission, right? So I think kind of step one is really establishing what is the mission, right? And then step two is really how do we get there, right? Not really just from like a business planning perspective, but also, right, from a values and culture perspective, right? We're at really the center of many ways of a lot of companies' mission and culture. We're trying to find ways to create environments, right, for these companies that are going to make you feel like I walked into a business and this is what it's all about, right? I saw the website, that was great. I met whoever it was, right, who I said they were going to meet. But then I went to their facility and I feel like this is like they're really living their missions, right? It's a special thing. So it's at the core of what we do. We actually did a visioning exercise. I'd say this was a few months ago, which is pretty cool. It was a cool journey to go through, where we had people come in and really help us figure out like what was really driving what we were doing. And part of it was to really help us, you know, create, you know, a way to kind of brand ourselves and market ourselves. But I'd say the output of it was pretty unique, where, you know, the employees like really appreciated it, right? They really felt like this was the true meaning of why we're doing this. So that's something that I'd be always happy to pass along the person's name. I mean, he did a great job with it, but it's something that we really spent a lot of time with and dug deep, you know, into like really creating, you know, a value set that really made sense. And it's helped, and it's kind of had like this multimodal approach to everything. I mean, between recruiting, retention, looking after potential clients that we're going to work with, it's helped in a lot of different ways.
Great. Thank you, Steele. I appreciate what you're saying, because I agree. We just went through that as well in our organization, and it's a deep process. It's not simple, and it does take some support and help from, you know, different people and experts, right? Because if you try to do it by yourself, you don't know what you're doing. Believe me. So Stephanie, I'll kind of toss that same question over to you. Like, you know, you're in the midst of that, probably, you know, trying to figure that out, and love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. So I couldn't agree more with what you all have said in terms of defining that mission. It's really critical. And what I found is that's the anchor point, right? That's the foundation on which you build your entire business, and not only from hiring, recruiting, marketing, you know, customer development standpoint, but also the thing that I'm finding, which carries through on that thread, is from the fundraising perspective, right? So I've found that from a and there are many other events and talks on that topic, which I'm sure people will get more in depth on. But from the fundraising perspective, I found that when we have spoken with folks who have the same level of passion that aligns with our company's vision and our values, boy, the conversation is just so different, and it's so energizing, and it's so much more productive than chatting with a funding individual who doesn't share that same alignment. Then it's more, nuts and bolts, term sheets, things like this. But when you find another person, group, or interested party that shares that alignment of your mission and your value set, it's an incredible energizing force.
Right. Thank you, Stephanie. So Timothy, what have you seen with some of the students and innovators that you've encountered? Has that been a hard thing to grasp for them? Do they feel like they should do that first, or do they feel like you should go right into the product or service kind of building aspect?
It totally depends on the founder. These days, we see so many people that are so focused on social innovation, mission-driven innovation, so many people that sort of want to do good in the world without seeing it burn down. So they are very focused on sort of values, visions, mission, articulation, but the tough tech founders as well. And we often talk about the difference between process and product, where, a lot of times everybody wants to focus on product and outcomes and what's going to come of all this. But what really happens is the processes you have in place to articulate these things are often far more important than the actual outcomes themselves. Because when you have your early employees and your leadership, and you think some of your best people, you're like, surely these people have our elevator pitch down and can articulate what we're doing. And then you start probing and they don't feel like they can at all. But you run these mission, vision, values, exercises, and frameworks, and you give them the opportunity to try to articulate what is it that we're working on in their own language, what are the values that we espouse, what's our internal culture. And even if it's stuff you've said a million times, the fact that they take the 10 minutes or 2 hours or 8 hours, write those things on sticky notes, put all those sticky notes, have everybody have the opportunity to see that together. It has this process aspect that binds everybody together, empowers everybody to articulate what the mission. And then suddenly you have these moments where you're like, oh, everybody is aligned, everybody is on point. And then you also see who your outliers are, like who is not into this, who is not bought into the mission, who, maybe needs to go, or, who is too much of a loner at this stage in the company. So incredibly powerful, incredibly impactful. I totally agree with everybody.
Great. Thanks, Timothy. That's awesome. You say that product and process in terms of what order that needs to be. I mean, it's important. They're both, equally important, but I like the way so hopefully the audience can take that away, just like attitude and aptitude. Those are two key words here. So how important is it? Because when you're handing over the reins to whoever you're hiring, how important is vision and mission to trust, right? And because essentially, Steele, you've had to do it. Stephanie, you've had to probably do some of that work. I'd love to hear, Stephanie, from your perspective, how trust plays into that initial delegation process and the hiring, because like Steele said, you got to start letting go, right?
Yes, absolutely. And so the trust aspect, trust is a gift, and it has to develop over time. And so the way I think about that is really the enabling mechanism to start to build trust is open communication. And I rely on that in almost any situation, right? So I'm sure we've all been in a situation where we've read a job description, we come in, we start the job really excited, and the job is nothing at all what we've expected, right? So that in a very small tacit way is sort of an impingement on that trust level. So it's about really being open and honest and candid with the communication to establish trust, right? To get that other person's thoughts and perspectives and make sure that both parties are agreeing on, okay, what are the expectations, but what does good look like, right? So if we don't have that conversation and we haven't established that framework of trust, it's very easy to go off in different directions. And then you come down the road and you find that you're not moving as fast as you need to. That person may not be as fulfilled as they had expected. They're not living up to the expectations that you had for them. And that all can, in my opinion, be solved with that establishing trust through open communication and really continuing to be consistent in applying that mechanism.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. And Timothy, what's your perspective on kind of dealing with the student body aspects of this? Same question. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is such a tricky question. I think part of initial delegation is really comes to the founder, the CEO, to have a really complete high-level understanding of where they want the organization to go. Because at the end of the day, that highest level perspective and the articulation of what do I need to get there? What are the things that need to get done? What do I need to get off my plate? Because that's really what informs who you're hiring and what is going. And then you have to ask yourself, is this person going to be somebody who can come in? If they're a senior level person, are they articulating a plan from day one for how they're going to take this stuff off my plate? Or if they're a junior level person, am I empowering them to sufficiently shadow the right people so that as quickly as possible, this stuff is disappearing from my plate so that I can then focus on the other stuff, right? I mean, in some sense, as the higher you are in the organization, the longer your time horizon of thinking about is. So, your goal is to get all of the hour by hour, day-to-day stuff off your plate. And, and when you start to see that that's successful, you've successfully delegated. And then the longer the time horizon, the more successful you're being and being a high-level executive.
Great. Thanks for that, Timothy. And so given that the one person that's on our staff, our panel here is Steele, having started your organization recently, how does that play into what you've seen with the trust factor and all of that stuff and kind of the delegation process?
Yeah, I think a common theme has been time, right? Time equals more trust, right? And it takes time to do that. It's funny, we look at the same way with clients and companies we want to work with, right? Like for us, it's not about we never say no one's a transaction, right? They're people first, right? And it takes a long time to really earn people's trust, right? The more open they are with us, the better we can really help them. So that's one of the key values that for us, right, that really goes through our entire organization, right? It's not just about, the immediate return, right? It's about building a sustainable business, right? Sustainable relationships. The one person that we really brought in who's taken a lot off my plate, I've known him, been fortunate to know him for a long time, right? So he's a great person, and he's been really able to jump in. And I think also he's been really good at identifying things that he's really good at, things that he's not very good at, right? Which is also important. And he's humble enough to say, hey, this is something I can't really do, or something that I'm not good at, or this is something that I would be better served, passing off to somebody else, right? And how do we go out after that next person, right? Do we have enough scale to hire that person to support this person, right? So, I started to allude to it earlier, right? Expecting for that person to kind of do everything isn't. It's almost like just creating a second person that it's another one of you, someone who's actually complimentary, who can actually see around the corner and say, hey, I've been through this before and I can really help you there. For me, it's been invaluable. Every founder has their own needs, right? Some founders are more technical. Some founders are better on operations. Some founders are better at sales, whatever it might be. I could sit here and say that I'm good at everything, but I know that there's certain things that I'm good at. Really finding that person is really complimentary to you, who can really help you look around the corner and say, hey, here's the things that you really have to pay attention to, is critical. And then over time, I mean, like I said, I was fortunate to know this person for a very long time. I can envision that it's pretty challenging to let go to someone that you just met, 3-4 months ago, right? So that even that vetting process on really understanding who this person is, the makeup of them, and having those open communications is really important.
Right. Thanks, Steele. The previous panel, there was I think one of the last major points was about what are you hiring people for? Like, to really kind of think about that. What are they good at, right? You're hiring them for their strengths, right? And that's a valuable part of the combination of the process of the complementary aspects that you're talking about here. So let's switch it around a little bit, because we've been in this pandemic. We're moving into a different phase. So what happens in terms of looking for people, but the person that you really like or are having these conversations with is remote, right? And clearly that word of who's working where and all of this stuff, and how we're kind of moving companies and organizations forward. Remote work and people working remotely have an impact on them as a next hire or big hire, as well as the culture. So Steele, I'll turn it right back to you. I mean, what would you do in this situation? Because clearly that's a potential situation you could be running into very, very quickly here.
Right. So first, I'd say that every organization is obviously different, right? And we have some companies who have major sales teams, right? And everyone is in the office and they feel like they're a big component of that. That's a big driver of their culture. We have other organizations who have raised hundreds of millions of dollars and they have, an office for 20 people, but they're a 600-person organization, right? I'd say that, tying it back to culture, right? I think culture is really, it's a challenge to build remotely, right? But being really methodical is super important. And Tim was making a comment earlier as we were just chatting about this whole world of just new talent pools that you can enter into, really, which is pretty unique, right? Pretty unique as an employer, right? Now, I think a big thing that a lot of employers are going to start getting into is really this whole function of retention, right? How do I retain these people and ensure that, I hired them for this task or her for this role, right? They have a certain, job to do, and hoping they exceed, and I hope they also feel like they're part of something that's really special. I think that's really hard to do in virtual settings. You need to find ways to kind of balance that, if you will, right? Or counterbalance it. It's funny, our job has really morphed from just quote unquote finding space to really helping companies build environments that's very inclusive of all these different people who have all these different methodologies of work. It's gotten much more, I'd say that this whole world of workplace experience has really gotten amplified, right? Where we kind of have a saying of like, we want your workspace to work harder for you, right? And if you're going to bring people together, right, in person, it should be a very valuable experience for people, right? They shouldn't feel like, suddenly so-and-so came in from, my aunt came in from wherever and I haven't seen her in years, right? They really want to feel they're part of a community. And it's really hard. I mean, it's really hard, but I think there's also been a lot of advantages as well for these employers. So Tim probably has better insight as far as some of these companies who are on the ground, especially the early stage companies.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, so the remote employee question, it's here forever. It's never going away. So it's something I think all of us are going to have to learn to get good at. How do you have remote teams where you're creating culture, where people are engaged, feel like they belong, and then also like, what does accountability look like? So when you're thinking about your benchmarks for success, like what are we going to get done in the next 6 months or year? Like, how do I know this person isn't working 2 jobs? Because that's a thing now, right? Is people taking on 2 coding jobs and not letting the other employer know and taking in 2 incomes. And do you care? Like, if they're hitting their benchmarks, do you care that they have 2 jobs? But I think that is sort of this next generation type of cultural operations that I think it's an entire new skill set that probably most people aren't very good at, and we're gonna have to learn how to function in that way. And one of the big problems I think I've seen a lot is then when you have mixed teams, people that are hybrid and remote, remote and in person at the same time. Then what happens to the culture? Because those human interactions might work really well when everybody's on Zoom, but don't at all work when some people are present and some people aren't. And then those people feel disconnected. And I think, really being proactive, right? There's this phrase, right? If you don't make culture, culture will make itself. And how do you handle that in this new environment? I'm not sure that there's best practices around this yet, but playing games together or having staff lunch or whatever that looks like, some moments of engagement where people can be humans and not just work really matters.
Right. Thank you, Tim. I mean, I think it's a great perspective, coming from both of you so far. Stephanie, love to hear from you, kind of how this perspective is, impacted your organization.
Right. So it's definitely, as Tim said, it's here to stay. And where I come out on this is I actually, if you look at the demographic research and, where the workforce is migrating, there's, from our perspective, we have a lot of offshore resources. So that's a little bit more of our culture. But I haven't seen any good guidelines either yet in terms of how do we bridge this new world from the traditional everyone needs to be in the office. I don't see that as being the majority of the workforce going forward in more of these emerging businesses. For your traditional industries, definitely. You see that all the time in the news. People are getting called back to the office, and there are some rumblings about that. So I think it's still to be explored, but I think that's kind of the neat thing about where we all stand is it is something new, and we all do have the ability to think about how we can influence where that goes, and sharing insight and best practices to other folks who are all here in the same boat trying to figure out the same thing. So I think it's a neat challenge that we'll all be exploring pretty heavily in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is still, the jury's still out on how this is going to work, right? I mean, and everyone's business is different. I think it's how do you interact with your clients and your customers, and is it a product or is it a service or a combination of the two? I don't think there's a clear formula. I mean, I'm kind of interested in hearing once we get to the Q&A side, what some of the people here have seen with the companies you work for or the companies you run, whatever the case may be. So anyway, why don't we kind of switch this a little bit? So in terms of Steele, hesitancies that you had when you were turning over the reins, like when you hired your CEO, I know the person, and but still, there's got to be a little bit of that. That you had, as part of the process?
Yeah, I mean, definitely finance is a big one, right? I think that's probably a really big one. Also, over the years, you just amass so many relationships with different vendors and different partners, and, kind of like almost having that person take over those relationships, still being cognizant that you might have built a relationship with someone for 10 years, right? And then also the other piece of it as well is someone really guiding you from the investment perspective on where to make investments. Like I wasn't excited to drop X amount of dollars on an IT managed service provider, but it was necessary, and build all this firewall infrastructure and all these things that you don't really think about, right? Because you can just operate through Google and everything's fine, right? It's not really the case as you grow. So someone to really, who was really saying, like, very proactive on, here's certain investments that we need to make. You're not going to like it, but it's necessary. And trusting that that's the right thing to do, right? And I certainly wouldn't have known if he hadn't come on. So,
right. Thank you. In terms of Stephanie, what's your perspective on that? I mean, given that you're the COO, you're probably the second big hire of your organization, so you've come in at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, so in terms of the hesitancy question, I think that for me, I've learned over time to be very open and honest, and I like to convey that with any new folks that I bring on. And I think the only hesitancy that I have still is the other person's comfort level, right? Are they at the same comfort level that I am when I say, look, I'm open to feedback. Let's have a really open dialogue. And let's, make sure that we have the right framework to talk about if something's not where we need it to be. But I think it just, again, takes time to get to know that person's disposition and whether or not they're actually going to call BS on something, and you're going to have a really engaged, open dialogue and discussion. And that's the only hesitancy, is just feeling out that dynamic and making sure that as a leader, I'm carving out the space for that person to feel safe, that if that's not their natural tendency, that they can grow into that, and that they can know that that's an honest, earnest extension. When I say that I want open dialogue, that, you know, that's a meaningful proposal, and that, you know, they're welcome to share in that level of dialogue.
Right, and that's part of the building trust part, right? So you can let go and, you know, essentially make sure that that person feels comfortable and safe to be able to work through those issues that they're going to encounter as part of that transition. So Timothy, in terms of the students you're dealing with, how do you convey that? Because that's a pretty big thing to think about, right? Especially when they're heads down trying to just build the company.
Yeah, there's an important phrase here: trust but verify. Right. So one of the mechanisms I've seen that works really well is, you know, how are you creating accountability in these situations? Because especially when you reach that tipping point of 15 to 20 employees where you no longer have direct insight into every single human, right? Now you've got managers or senior directors that are taking these things over, and they kind of become black boxes to you. So what accountability mechanisms are in place such that other people on your team are also keeping an eye on the store, right? And are you putting things in place, not just so that all information flows through you, but such that if something is going wrong over here, some other member of your senior team or somebody else is going to know about it and is going to see things go off the rails. I recently saw a case where somebody for 6 months had been heads down by themselves or with their team, and said, "Oh, I'm leaving, just letting you guys know, giving you 2 weeks notice." And then they left, and it turned out they hadn't been doing anything for 6 months. And I was sort of aghast talking through the executive whose responsibility this was. And I was like, "How did you not know?" And she was just like, "We just did not have insight into his area. It was a black box." And so, you know, trust that these people are going to do well and have the best intentions in mind, but have mechanisms in place, whether that's report outs or monthly meetings or not micromanagement, but whatever is necessary to make sure that people are hitting their benchmarks and that nobody's an island unto themselves.
I was just going to say, I mean, given that it's Boston Startup Week, right? I'd say, especially startups, it's really important that you don't avoid conflict. I mean, I think that's one of the probably the biggest issues. I mean, I think just generally it's an issue with a lot of the workforce today that people are very, you know, they're afraid of conflict, right? And I think ultimately you need conflict, whether it's internally or externally, whatever it might be, to make progress, right? Some of these conversations are really hard. They really are. I don't want to have them. You know, people don't really want to have them, but it's the only way you move ahead. And honestly, through a lot of the conflict as well, when I think of like some of our internal team members, we become stronger because of it, right? We're not afraid to have conversations with each other. We're not afraid to sit down and say, "Hey, you were wrong," or "I was wrong," and how do we get this resolved? Because that's what adults do, right? You know, it's life is not the same way. Life doesn't serve you an issue on a golden platter, right? It comes up to you and hits you, and you got to find a way to respond to it. And you know, I think generally it's a theme that we have. We always, you know, and I actually got this from I'm sure you know Christian Magel from Ventureland. He used to, when I first started working with him, he used to say, "Good news and bad news is good news. Bad news is, or no news is bad news," right? And I always thought that was a kind of a good way to sum it up, right? Where it's, you know, tell me the news, like, so we can get this fixed and get it resolved, right? And I think sometimes we put up these barriers expecting for everyone to just do it. You know, "Oh, I hired you for this thing and you should just do it and get it done." But that person might not know how to do that thing, and they feel like they just are supposed to just do it, right? So that's probably one of my biggest things, and it's something that we talk about at the company all the time. Just don't avoid conflict. Yeah.
Great point. Yeah, I mean, you avoid it, it's going to come around somewhere, right? And so, you know, what I've heard here is, you know, words of trust and accountability, right? And so it's important. It's like, so have you ever had to take the helm back, right? When, you know, decisions were made or not made, right? You know, and so Stephanie, I'd love to hear from you, you know, any insight on that.
So I take the pacifist approach, and I like to think about taking the helm back more as redistribution across the team. And why I say that is because, you know, theoretically, the time, effort has been put in as an investment for this individual on your team. And so, you know, one of the things I like to think about in the dynamic of, you know, maybe that person doesn't know how to do what has been asked of them, given, many, support structures and training, things like that. And so it really comes down to, okay, can you reorganize or, dynamically readjust, recalibrate the team? Do they have some, I mean, theoretically you hired them because they have some skill set, right? You've hired them because they have something that they're bringing to the table. So it's really more so, if it doesn't work, then maybe they can go somewhere else. Maybe there's an opportunity to have someone else grow and develop in that space. But yes, I have had to take the helm back, and it's not pleasant, but I like to at least ensure that as a leader, I've taken all steps possible to ensure that I've at least tried as much as possible to maintain that person if I think they're worth maintaining.
Great point. I mean, I think one of the key questions that I want to ask, all three of you is, so what happens when that person's, a senior leader, right? Because it's one thing, to your point, that it's, individual contributor who's, further down the pipeline, obviously a great support person. But when they're a senior leader, how much time do you give them, right, to make that decision where it's not working, right? And I think that's every organization struggles with that in terms of how long do you leave a person at that level in the role, because every decision they make, right, could affect the rest of the company in terms of the trajectory, whether it's up or down. So, Steele, love to hear from you.
Yeah, it was interesting. One of our, really fortunate to work with a company called Link Squares. So Vishal Sunak's been a great mentor, and he talks a lot about just like, almost like right now, when you start a company, your kind of family tree is everything's, horizontal, right? And eventually you go from, having, like, I took a transition from going from 15 direct reports to 3 direct reports. And that was a big transition for me. Talk about kind of letting go. And I'd say there's absolutely times where I said, I got to reel this thing back in or pull it back in. Which is, it's hard to do, but I think the more you communicate, the more you over communicate, the easier it is, because you can kind of see, the direction certain things are headed. And sometimes they're just like simple guardrails with like, hey, I just want to make sure we're aligned on this. Right. So with all of our direct reports, we have regular check-ins, which makes a big difference as well, where you can kind of get ahead of it. Certainly I have a job to do during the day, as does, all of our, other folks who are executives as well. But the more you just kind of, if you let it go completely, they can also lead to issues as well. Because there's, it's, the game plan is always changing and always evolving, right? As a business, right? People come in, people come out, your customer base changes, your services grow. And, the whole organization in many ways needs to be somehow informed or at least aware of it, especially the folks who are leading.
Great, Steve. Stephanie, how about your perspective on that? Because, you talked a little bit about, giving them some room, redistributing, but clearly at a senior level, it could be a very different conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's different at a senior level. The expectations are much higher. And I think coming into those type of roles, that's expected. And so one of the frameworks that I've used in the past, and I've seen other senior teams and executive teams leverage, is that 90-day check-in, right? So, coming in with, what's the plan for 30 days? And generally that's really ramping up. Who are you meeting with? How are you getting to know the business? Your 60-day plan. Okay, what are your assessments? What are your observations? Where do you see areas for improvement? What do you see as a senior leader coming in? What insight are you bringing? And then, the last 30 days is, okay, what's the implementation plan for what we as an executive team agree on? So I like that framework because it gives that roadmap and those checkpoints and those benchmarks of accountability. And you'll know fairly quickly as an executive if things aren't marching in the trajectory at the pace at which it has to in order for your business to grow. So in that case, I think it's a hard conversation, but knowing as a leader, you've given that individual every opportunity possible to really step up.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's back to the process part that Timothy spoke about. But you're right, onboarding is important, right? I mean, it doesn't matter whether, first time employee right out of college all the way up to a senior leader. I think onboarding is one key thing to really think about. You can't just hire somebody and have them show up day one and it's like, okay, you know what your job is, right? I think it's really difficult. That it's got to be something very intentional. And that also speaks to culture. I think that person is now evaluating you and the organization and says, okay, well, this is what you told me, but this is what I'm seeing, right? And so that doesn't bode well sometimes if you're not doing a good job there. So
and also, I mean, ultimately, like, you care and they care, right?
Yeah.
And I think they came to work with you probably because they feel like you care about them and they care about you, right? And I wouldn't underestimate that, right? I think, yeah, ultimately it's business, and we want to make money and do well and all that other stuff, right? But ultimately, they also care about each other as well, right? And like, whenever we're given feedback, like, it's because we care and we want them to be better, to get better, right? Same reason why I always welcome people to come into my door and at my office and say, hey, I thought you could have handled this differently, or hey, this is an area that we need to focus on. Like, we fully encourage it. Whether I want to hear it or not, it's one thing, but it's part of it, right? But I think a lot of the young companies, especially, right? I mean, ultimately, people are coming to work for you because they care about the mission, they care about you, and ultimately, they're going to see you also have to respond to some challenges as a business, whether it's employees, whether it's products, whether it's whatever it might be. And the way they see you when you're kind of your toughest times and toughest moments, in many ways, is going to how they kind of judge you, right, going forward, because it's not all peachy.
No. Great point. I love that last point. Timothy, anything from the student
Yeah,
perspective that you're
I mean,
feeling?
so I maybe add a little bit of a different perspective, which is, I think, be more willing to fire sooner, to be blunt. Not just because of the damage that somebody who's not up to snuff is doing to the company itself, but talent knows talent, and your best people are going to smell who isn't a best person. And if you have one person who's bringing down the whole team or the whole company, your best people are going to know. And one of the best indicators I've ever seen of sort of the canary in the coal mines is when your best people start looking for other jobs or start leaving, because then something's wrong. And a lot of times what happens is when that, not great person or bad apple does leave, then your best people say, oh, thank gosh, that person is finally gone. And you say, whoa, why didn't you tell me this whole time? And they're like, well, you were trying to give them an extra chance. And, because there's this trade-off between, being a good leader and a helpful person and like helping people reach their full potential and signaling to the team that like, just because you doesn't make a mistake, you're not going to get fired right away. But then the other side of the piece is like, people that aren't cutting it, making the grade, the rest of your team is going to start saying, well, I'm not going to work as hard, or I'm not dedicated to this, or we're not living up to our values because of this. So I think sometimes they gotta go.
No, I mean, like, you make a great point, and it's a very complicated process, right? You want to give people the opportunity. You want to, be as prepared as possible as you can. The 90 days aspect, I love that. But you know what? Senior leaders, they're at the top, right? And they've got to be able to, pull their weight and give, the approach of making sure they're setting the example for everybody else in the organization. Because as you said, the ones that you trust and have underneath you that have been there for a while are going to start looking, right? And I think that's a dangerous situation to find yourself in, because not only will you lose the person at the top that you just hired, you're going to lose 3 or 4 others along the way because it's too late. You reacted too late.
I would add too, right? The labor markets right now are crazy, right? So there's this whole added dimension that I don't think most young startups or companies are used to, which is like, are we able to get talent to fill these roles, right? Like, you might have some really great role open and just can't find anybody for a while. So then you're thinking, well, if I fire this person, like, what's worse? They're like temporary incompetence for the next X months, or not having anybody and suffering through that's a hard trade-off. I think you have to make that internal assessment for yourself. And that's when really good mentors or investors or your networks can help you, either get temp people or somebody to come in and fill that role.
Yeah, great point. I love that. So we got about 11 minutes left. I want to go ahead and leave some room for Q&A, because I think we've heard a lot, but we'd love to hear from you. Anybody want to ask a question of either the entire panel or individual person? Yep. Yes, go ahead.
I heard the
Yeah.
I heard the recurring theme of trust taking time, but what's your guidance for when you just don't have the convenience of time, right? Like trust, you're working to build trust within the team, but you've got to delegate tasks quicker than that time that trust builds.
Let's take a shot at that.
I'll go for that. So, granted, yes, time is a luxury that we often don't have. So in that case, honestly, you've got to trust yourself and trust your gut. And, part of that trust is I don't have all the answers, but this is, the best information that I have. And this is the best for right now. And then if it turns out you have to quickly turn around and recalibrate, then you have to do it. But again, as a leader, you got to trust yourself. And if you don't have the time, you got to do what's best for your team and the company.
Yeah, I would just add, that's why your first 10 hires are so important, because then that 11th hire, the other 10 are going to be able to fill in and acculturate this person in the right way and keep an eye and make sure they're the right person. So you can go on to 12 through 20.
Other questions that we can answer? Yes.
Hey, Ketan here. A question from the different perspective. When you are trying to join a startup and you talk to a CEO, right, and you are all aligned on vision and everything, but you see a lot of red flags in terms of this letting go, right? It's very obvious. Like sometimes it's like you can see that you can take it, but you won't be successful. How do you navigate that? Because your one option is you let it go, right? You just pass on. But is there anything else that you can do?
Steele, you want to take a crack at that? Tough one.
I'd probably say like there's also a lot of vendors, right, that you can leverage, right? It's obviously you have people internally, but a lot of it comes back to like taking advice from folks who have been doing certain components of whatever it is you're trying to solve, right? Like we have like really strong accountants and accountants that we work with, right, who can really give us guidance on how to structure certain things. We kind of grew, even from a real resource perspective, from a legal perspective, where we folks who do everything from not just general law, but also real estate and all these other components, right, from a resources perspective. So I think just over the years, we've been fortunate to just develop all these other folks and resources and advocates in your network. Certainly like it's a lot of risk to launch a business. And your network is really powerful. I would lean on your network as hard as possible, to really give you some of that guidance, from people who have really been through it before. We're fortunate where we can ask a lot of advice from a lot of really great people, and we just built a lot of great will people who are willing to help and want to see us be successful. So if you don't know, right, and you still are unsure about it, I mean, leaning on people who have experience either with that one person in particular, or maybe have dealt with that situation previously, just from my experience, is probably the best route.
Stephanie, Timothy, any perspectives you want to offer?
So I interpreted the question a little differently. Were you asking if you're meeting with a CEO and you're feeling that CEO has red flags about letting go and delegating? So one of the things that I might think about is, so for me, if you can walk away, of course, right? But if it's something that you are really passionate about and you feel like you really, really want to be there, this is just me, I would look at that as a really fun challenge, right? So how can you work with that CEO? I mean, most CEOs, they're good at what they do because that's who they are. And so maybe they just don't know how to let go. So that's an incredible challenge from a human dynamic, to think about, okay, what can I do to come in and help alleviate some of the stress on this person and maybe teach them how to let go. But it's a tough road, so you've got to really want it.
All right. Thank you. Any other questions that we can offer? Is there anything online that we need to answer? I wasn't sure if there was anything there. I just want to double check.
Look around the corner.
I know.
That's okay.
In the interim, I would just add then call them out, right? If you see red flags in a CEO that you're interviewing for, call them out and say, hey, I don't think, are you prepared to let go? They're getting beaten up by worse people than you in the terms of investors or customers or somebody else. So if you can't stress test them and come out satisfied, don't take the job, or help them win you over.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I mean, I've seen situations myself where I've asked the question is, so you talk about all the things you want to do, and what's your appetite for change? Because they have to answer honestly, and if you don't feel good about that answer, then they're not, right? Because they're going to have a hard time letting go, and you have to think twice about whether you want to join that organization, whether it's a consultant or as a full-time employee. And I've walked away from things because I didn't feel right about it, right? And I'm like, great pay, great product, great service, but that answer just didn't sit right with me. So yeah, don't be afraid. I love that point. I think just in this day and age, it's just too much of an investment that you're making, right, on both ends of the equation. So, any questions online?
Nothing online right
Okay.
now.
Couple more minutes. Any other thoughts, questions, observations?
Easy crowd.
Yeah.
All right, there we go.
I said that. No.
You were almost off the hook.
Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting discussion here. So my question is, when the startup grows, and at the beginning, the CEOs is usually a founder, and the skill set that they have to start the company might be completely not the skill set that you need to grow the company. So on that transition, and it's kind of maybe around 15 people and beyond, where you need to kind of grow, develop a different skill set to become actually an effective manager. So, but sometimes maybe that's not the right person to then grow the company even more beyond. So what are the typical, what is the advice that you can give to founders to make the transition, or to question whether they're actually the right person to continue running the company?
It's a great question.
I'll take a stab at it. So I think it first starts with really help. The CEO has to identify what they're really good at, right? For me, it was interesting where if you think of our industry, right? Traditionally, I guess professionals in our industries are expected to do kind of a whole lot of everything at the same time, which a lot of times leads to inefficiency. So we found a way to almost basically break out, right, the role of that specific advisor, right, into someone who's very good at maybe in the business development side or transaction side or market side or consulting side. So I kind of did the similar exercise with myself, right, to really identify what I'm good at and things that I'm not good at or might not have experience in. And that was kind of the big reason why we brought a COO in, right, somebody who basically has those skill sets. So I think as a CEO, they have to really be true to themselves, right, and say, okay, what am I really good at? And what are those major gaps that I need to fill? We talked about earlier, I'm sure Tim sees it all the time with very technical founders, folks who are very focused on operations or production, and maybe for a technical founder, they might want to remain the CEO, but they bring somebody in who's the president and COO who's an incredible operator, right? And then vice versa, So I think really the CEO has to really kind of look themselves in the mirror and say, what am I really good at and where are my weaknesses?
That's a great point. I mean, I'll add to that. I think a lot of the conversations I've had with some CEOs is they're wanting to do everything. They want to hold on to everything. And the advice I gave them was, if you don't hire a COO soon enough that can operate, your company is going to be in trouble, right? And it's because you're going to lose clients, you're going to lose customers, and you don't know where the problem is, right? And that's, not knowing where the problem is worse. And you have to be able to figure that out quick. So you need somebody on staff that can figure that out and then motivate the team and move the team down that path. So I think it's important to establish that, right? So CEOs are essentially a key hire the next. They may not be the COO, but they're definitely operational in nature, right?
And part of the reason we pulled the trigger so early in infancy is just the, I realized that I couldn't really focus on 2023 planning, right? And for us, you had a great methodology earlier. We're basically in 30, 90, 180 day, and then 3 year. 3 years we call it our bigger, hairy, audacious goals. And then 30, 90, 180 are highly achievable goals. And I couldn't really get into like, okay, what does this mean when we turn the corner here? And for me, I just couldn't allocate the headspace, which was an issue, right? And bringing somebody in who can kind of get me out of that, if you will, day-to-day things that, quite frankly, I'm trying to figure out because I've never done it before. Just allow me to get that headspace and that breathing room to really say, okay, here's the direction that we want to head, right? I think of a lot of ways the CEO and very much has to be very visionary, right? In many ways, right? They kind of, you might have multiple founders sometimes, multiple founders, which sometimes happens as well. At some point, you have to figure out who exactly is going to be, that CEO leader. It doesn't mean that you have to lead in everything, right? But you might have to lead in a certain facet of the organization. But for us, I know that I needed to really find the headspace, which honestly, and if I didn't find the headspace, it was going to hold not just myself back, but the entire organization, right? Which isn't fair to everybody else.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love those last points about headspace. We all need it, right? CEOs especially, and they need to be able to think freely about solving these types of problems. Okay, I think we're just about out of time, right, Nick?
Just about time for parties and drinks
Awesome.
in the lobby.
Perfect.
Well, it was great having everyone here. I love the questions and appreciate everybody here at Startup Week. Timothy, Stephanie, Steele, awesome. Great to know you guys, and I love the energy you guys brought forth here and the different perspectives. So thank you very much.
Thanks,
That's
Daniel.
the wrap up for
Thanks,
the first
everybody.
day.